Good evening, everyone. I will just make one more note before we get started. I do apologize, we have reached capacity when it comes to chairs, but you folks, please do make yourself available back there. You can still look in, and if anybody is in dire need of a chair back there as well, please just flag me down. I'll come out and see you following my introduction and ensure that we can accommodate you. First of all, good evening all. Thank you so very much for joining us here tonight. It's wonderful to see a standing room audience here this evening to celebrate Josiah Neufeld's incredible new book, The Temple at the End of the Universe. I could not be more pleased to be here, helping to welcome this book into the world, and would like to just start by expressing my sincere thanks to House of Anansi for publishing this book in the first place and giving us all a wonderful reason to gather tonight. I would also like to begin by acknowledging that McNally Robinson is located here on Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. I won't belabor my own opening comments. I know no one is here to see me, and we have an incredible conversation ahead of you. I just have a few very brief housekeeping notes before I introduce tonight's book and tonight's participants. The first is that there will be a reading and presentation from Josiah here at the podium, followed by a conversation which will take place on these chairs to my left with the incredible Joan Thomas. Following that, please applaud. I'm going to make you applaud her again too, so just wait. After that, there'll be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions. So if you do have a question, all I'll ask is that you put up your hand and I will run over to you, Sally, Jesse, Raphael style, and I will place a microphone in front of your face. This is not a comment on your ability to project your voice. It just ensures that those folks watching at home can actually hear the questions that you're asking. If you happen to be one of those people watching at home, please feel free to write any questions you might have just in the live chat on YouTube or any positive comments you might have for Josiah. And we'll pass along the questions during the Q&A and the comments following the event. I will have some stirring notes about signing procedure for you at the end of the event. But the only thing I will put in your head right now is that we'll ask you just to give us one moment so we can safely transport Josiah to the signing table just beside our cash desk before the throng descends so that you might get your book signed. And I'll give you a few more details on that at the close of the event. But for now, we are here to celebrate The Temple at the End of the Universe, a search for spirituality in the Anthropocene, a journalistic memoir by a lapsed evangelical Christian that examines how the ecological crisis is shifting the ground of religious faith. I was going to speak extemporaneously about this book, but instead I will put it to somebody much better with words than myself. And the reason I've chosen this particular quotation is because it not only makes reference to the subject matter, but also Josiah's incredible facility with words. I found myself throughout my own reading of this book constantly taken by his use of language, often to the point where I had to return to actually read through to the point he was making. So caught up was I in the incredible feats of linguistic wonder that Josiah is capable of. So this is an incredible book on multiple levels. And as Harley Rustad, the best-selling author of Lost in the Valley of Death and Big Lonely Doug has to say, The Temple at the End of the Universe is a gorgeously written and immaculately considered interrogation into faith in the age of climate change. Simultaneously demanding and stirring, this book is a necessary companion for anyone questing for meaning under dark, looming clouds while questioning their place in the future of the world. This is a book that speaks to the imperiled soul of our moment. Its author, Josiah Neufeld, explores how the interlocking crises of climate change have shifted the ground of religious faith on a quest that is both philosophical and deeply personal. It is a rallying cry for a new spiritual paradigm for the Anthropocene. Your host this evening, Joan Thomas, her fourth novel, Five Wives, was awarded the Governor General's Award for Fiction in 2019. Her fifth, the eagerly anticipated Wild Hope, will be released in September and will be launched in this very space on Friday, September 22nd. So mark that in your calendar. Our featured author tonight, Josiah Neufeld, is an award-winning journalist who grew up as an expatriate in Burkina Faso and returned to Canada as a young adult. His essays, journalism, and short fiction have been published in The Walrus, Hazlitt, The Globe and Mail, 18 Bridges, The Ottawa Citizen, The Vancouver Sun, Ootney Reader, Prairie Fire, and The New Quarterly. He lives in Winnipeg and is here with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Josiah Neufeld.
Thank you. What a delightful audience. So wonderful to see all your faces. Thank you all for coming out. I'll save my thank yous and acknowledgements for the end, but I just want to say I'm very grateful to all of you for being here, especially the people who are mentioned in my book who dared to be here. So that is especially warming to my heart. And for those people in the audience who consider themselves young people or children, there's something fun at the very end of this launch that you can look forward to. I won't tell you what it is, but just hang in there because there's going to be something fun just for you. So I'm going to read a few short sections from the book. I won't give too much by way of introduction because Joan has some very lovely questions prepared that we can spend some time talking about afterwards. So this first little section is just from the opening chapter. We need a new story, wrote the late Catholic priest and eco-theologian Thomas Berry. The old story, the biblical one about the creation of the world and the place of humans within it, had sustained us for a long time. It had taught us the meaning of suffering, explained the origins of evil, provided us with purpose, and showed us how to live. In the old story, the primordial human fault was being steadily repaired as human history moved toward its ultimate fulfillment. But the old story was no longer working, Berry said. The old story did not have room for scientific understandings of the 14 billion year history of our galaxy, or the emergence of human consciousness, the moment the universe became aware of itself. A purely secular scientific understanding of the world wasn't adequate either. It couldn't provide us with sufficient meaning or the social discipline necessary to lead spiritually fulfilled lives. We needed a story that was both scientific and spiritual, Berry said. A story that could provide morality, meaning, healing, and guidance in an age of ecological crisis. A story with liturgies to celebrate the formation of our solar system and the miracle of photosynthesis, and rituals to lament the species we were driving to extinction, each one a unique expression of divine presence. A story that could teach humans about the evolution of life and the mystery of existence and our place as part of an interdependent whole. We would either learn our proper place on the earth or we would destroy it. That new story is what I'm trying to explore in a tiny way in this book. This book is a narrative. It's a memoir. It's about my own spiritual journey or pilgrimage. And I'm going to read next from a short section where I'm in the middle of the deconstructing phase of this story. I met Mona when we were both university students. I was studying journalism, and she was working on a degree in conflict resolution. Like me, she was the child of missionaries. We'd grown up on opposite sides of the African continent. She in Sudan, I in Burkina Faso. She had a long sunshine-colored braid that hung down her back, spoke 4 languages, and enjoyed camping in the desert. The first time we met, she plucked a leaf from my hair and a little electric current ran from my scalp down through my feet to the ground. We both signed up for the same class, the study of voluntary simplicity, taught by a Benedictine oblate turned Buddhist who opened his first lecture by teaching us to meditate on an orange. The class examined the spiritual and environmental reasons why people choose to live lives of material restraint. Neither Mona nor I considered it an academic exercise. We shared a set of used textbooks. This was how we intended to live our lives. Mona had also been raised an evangelical Christian, but when we met, she was already well on her way out of the faith. She told me this in various ways, which I tried not to hear. We had so much in common: missionary childhoods, the struggle to find our places in the world, our efforts to see past the glare of our own privileges. We both lived on our summer earnings, scavenged food from dumpsters, and walked or cycled everywhere. I admired her jeans, salvaged from a thrift store and modified into bell-bottoms. Her Spartan library, the Bible, the complete works of Shakespeare, a book of Rumi's mystical poetry, inspired me to cull my own book collection. My university student housemates rolled their eyes. "I could tell by your clothes that you two were going to end up together," one of them said. Obviously, we were meant to be together, but I was wary. The God I'd grown up with was a jealous God, a God who repeatedly warned the Israelites not to marry women from surrounding nations, lest they be lured from his embrace. I wanted God to possess me. I filled my journals with letters asking to be burned up or poured out like an offering to him. When our rendezvous to share class readings began to devolve into makeout sessions on her futon, I decided it was time to invite Mona out for coffee and ask her what she believed about Jesus. She stared at me in startled silence over our cooling coffees. Then she answered my question with stories. Stories about growing up as a girl under a patriarchal faith. Stories about knowing that God did not love women the way he loved men. God had created women to meet the needs of men, to be homemakers, childbearers, comfort givers, servants. Mona did not want to be any of these things. She wanted to be a human, a doer, a leader, a sexual being. After high school, she'd tried to become a missionary herself. She'd spent 1.5 years on a ship named Logos II, stocked with Christian literature. It docked at port cities around the world where the ship's young missionaries would venture out to share the gospel. It was Mona's job to set up the speaking engagements. The preachers were all men, younger than she, and awkward in languages Mona spoke fluently. But she was not allowed to preach because God had not ordained women for that task. So she shelved books in the ship's bookstore and fell in and out of love with men who were looking for obedient wives. When she finally fled the ship, she knew she could never go back to her childhood faith. Mona wisely suggested we explore our faith in an exchange of letters. She stitched a sheaf of paper into a notebook and glued a cutout of a backpack and a camera on the cover to symbolize an expedition. We called it our collaborative novel and passed it back and forth, filling its pages with convictions, prayers, and fears, searching for common ground. After the ship experience, she wrote in the collaborative novel, I decided that everything was up for questioning except the existence of the divine, and that I would reconstruct things from there. I am still in the process, and you are so sure of everything, but this is where I am, and I can't change that now, even if it scares me, scares you, scares us. Do you think that my faith journey and our you and me journey can travel together for a while, holding the uncertainty gently, at least until we know that there is a fork in the road? She quoted Rainier Maria Rilke. She asked me to have patience with everything that remained unresolved within me, to strive to live the questions themselves. How prescient she was. I knew I should probably end the relationship, but I couldn't. I was enthralled by the poetry of her quest and the fragrance of her scalp. I followed the trail of questions she dropped like breadcrumbs, coaxing me deeper and deeper into the labyrinth. We continued writing to each other in our collaborative novel, long, searching, sometimes painful negotiations about what we believed and what we didn't. We agreed to live the questions, as Rilke advised. So the last excerpt I'm going to read is from a trip that I made to Wet'suwet'en territory in BC to support the Wet'suwet'en land defenders who were fighting a natural gas pipeline that was being built across their sovereign territory. This is in 2021. We knew the Wet'suwet'en leaders were making plans behind the scenes for the next stage of the resistance, but we didn't know when it would happen or what it would look like. The moment arrived at the end of September 2021. Molly Wickham, a leader from the Gidimt'en Grizzly clan, who went by her Wet'suwet'en name, Slado, and a small group of land defenders seized a site that Coastal GasLink had cleared next to the river as a drill pad from which they planned to bore under the sacred headwaters of the Wedson Kwa. Working swiftly under cover of night, Slado and her land defenders moved a tiny house trailer equipped with bunks and a wood stove onto a hill overlooking the muddy field Coastal GasLink had carved out of the forest. Slato called the new outpost Coyote Camp. An environmental report had recently revealed Coastal GasLink had allowed pollutants to flow into nearby rivers and streams. The Wet'suwet'en feared for the river. The land defenders barricaded the narrow road leading to the site with a pile of logs, a wrecked car, and an old school bus. Slato put out a call for support. "We want you to come here now," she said in a video posted to social media, her eyes hard as flint, one arm locked to the excavator. "We need legal observers. We need support on the ground. This is the fight of our lives. We have so much at stake. Drilling under Wet'suwet'en would absolutely devastate everything that is important to us. Please come." Watching the video, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I knew I had to go. I had just finished reading a report about the amount of carbon pollution Indigenous resistance had kept out of the atmosphere. Through a combination of civil disobedience, blocking pipelines with their bodies, and advancing claims to their sovereign territories in the courts, Indigenous-led campaigns across this continent alone have prevented or delayed an astounding 1.8 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions from entering the atmosphere. That's a quarter of the total annual emissions of Canada and the US combined. I was busy writing about Indigenous communities on the front lines of the climate crisis, but it wasn't enough just to write. I needed to do more. If I believed what I was writing about, then I needed to answer Slato's call. "I think I should go," I said to Mona at the breakfast table the next morning. I'd be gone for a week, 10 days max. My mouth was dry. I couldn't swallow my oatmeal. This was very sudden, and I expected Mona to have misgivings. She knew that by setting foot in the camp, I'd be violating a court injunction, putting myself at risk of arrest. But Mona was immediately supportive. "Is this something your soul is calling you to do?" she asked. "I think so," I said. "Then you should go," she said. "I'll flex my work time so I can drop off the kids at school and pick them up." By the end of the day, I'd rented a car and canceled my appointments for the week. I felt like I'd crawled into someone else's skin. I'm a cautious person by nature. I like to make plans far in advance and carefully consider the risks. I was about to step into the kind of conflict I'd never navigated before. The night before my departure, I lay in bed racked with anxiety, second-guessing myself. Mona held me. "I love you," I whispered. "Then go and do this with love," she whispered back. It was still dark the next morning when I hugged my daughter's small warm body curled in her nest of blankets and whispered, "I'll be back soon." My chest hurt. The night before, when she'd heard I was leaving, she'd clamped her knees around my leg and glared at me. "You're not going." I drove west as the sun crept up under a woolly cloud bank and cast its slanting orange glow across the stubbled wheat fields. Soon I was crossing Saskatchewan's gentle folded pasture land, scorched a dull brown by a summer of extreme drought. On the radio, I heard beer prices were going up due to a shortage of barley. By the time I reached Regina, the temperatures were nearing 30 degrees Celsius, unheard of for late September. Tears kept gathering in the corners of my eyes and tracking down my cheeks as I passed swells of desiccated pasture land. Fear ballooned in my chest. To keep myself from thinking of reasons to turn around and go back home, I kept repeating, "This is a hard thing, and you are doing it." I thought of Tara Hauska, an Anishinaabe land defender from Couchiching First Nation, who had led a campaign of civil disobedience in Minnesota months earlier in a last-ditch attempt to try to stop a pipeline expansion that would carry diluted bitumen from the Alberta tar sands to a terminal on Lake Superior. After being shot with rubber bullets, burned with pepper spray, and being locked in solitary confinement, she'd sent a message to her supporters: "Pray for us, stand with us if you can. Find your bravery. Our mother needs us so badly." I didn't know whether I was following a call from God or the universe or Mother Earth, but I knew it was real. "Find your bravery," I whispered to myself as I drove. And just skipping ahead to the end of this chapter where I spend some time in Wet'suwet'en territory. On my way back, I'm driving in the car and thinking about it. We in the West are witnessing the unraveling of a story of unhindered progress and divine favor and technological ascendancy and human achievement. This was the story European settlers told themselves when they perceived an empty land given to them by God. This was the story Justice McEachern referenced when he called the pine-clad mountains and salmon-filled rivers of the Wet'suwet'en territory a vast emptiness. That is the story that is ending. Another story is taking its place. Different lands have different gods, wrote Sioux intellectual Vine Deloria Jr. Deloria died in 2005, but he believed that Indigenous peoples would soon rise to reclaim their heritage and their lands. That is when the invaders of the North American continent will finally discover that for this land, God is red, he wrote. As I drove home and watched the great jagged mountains tumble into the long, soft sweep of the prairies, I tried to imagine what it would look like for me to honor the God of this land. Was it too late for Christianity to give up its claims of universal truth, to acknowledge other gods? Such a work of unraveling and repenting would surely involve erasing property lines and returning land. It would mean grasping the two ends of its timeline, creation and apocalypse, and bending them so they joined. It might involve fracturing a universal religion into many small, non-exclusive faiths, each in deep relationship with the land. For many of us, it would mean leaving the warm comfort of our houses and showing up at places like Coyote Camp. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. It was a joy to hear those passages again. I read this book twice with deepening appreciation in the second reading. And I have to say that about 18 months ago, when I heard that Josiah was writing a book on this topic, I just felt like the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It just feels so timely. It feels so necessary. And he has executed it so beautifully. We haven't known each other very long. I sense he's kind of a modest guy, so I don't want to go on at too much length about that, but it's just such a fine, fine book. So it's my honor to have this conversation with you tonight, Josiah. I'm very pleased to be doing that.
Well, thank you so much. I'm honored to be in this conversation with you.
We have had recently in Winnipeg a few conversations about this whole issue of climate change, and I'm very encouraged to see that conversation growing among groups of writers. And I think this book is really going to take that forward too. So, yeah. So it's so interesting to read about your childhood in West Africa, and I'm wondering how you see it as having laid a grounding for the work that you're doing now.
Well, certainly growing up in Burkina Faso, shaped me as who I am. I think, one of the foundational things that it did was cause me to be aware of my own privilege in a very stark way. A lot of my friends that I was growing up with were, growing the food that they ate using handheld tools, and I would come on furlough to Canada and encounter things like electric toasters and microwave ovens and flush toilets with furry toilet seats. I don't know if you've heard of those. And I was like, this is not a normal way to live. This is not how most people in the world live. I felt so acutely conscious of the privilege and the class gap, the gap between me and my friends in the community that I was living. So I think that experience just gave me a sense of global justice, and oriented me to see climate change as a justice issue. I also think that childhood experience of growing up as the child of missionary parents prepared me to see it as a spiritual issue too. It's not just climate change is about the deepest stories that we tell ourselves about meaning and why we're here on the earth. And even though my beliefs have changed and shifted over the course of my life and continue to do so, I still think of myself as a deeply spiritual person. And that experience.
Well, it strikes me that you were an outsider there and an outsider when you came home, probably to some degree. And that's a very valuable thing, especially now, because it's so hard to set ourselves outside the narrative of what constitutes success in our society and so on. But you came by it naturally through your childhood. You did some wonderful writing, and there's a passage that's quoted in this book. It was a time in West Africa when you were, I think you were 11 or 12, you were feeling a lot of distress. And your mother encouraged you to write about your feelings. She said, at some point you're going to want to remember how you felt. And you're noticing a theme here that the women in Josiah's life were pretty instrumental in getting him writing. He's read the passage about Mona, encouraging him to write too. Do you have a lot of writing from when you were young like that?
I have journals from when I was about 7 years old till my mid-20s, which are
Wow.
Entertaining and terrifying to read. I have writings that, you mentioned my mom. I think it's safe to say that she's one of the reasons why I'm a writer today, because of all the writing she encouraged me to do as a child, both in my journal and all kinds of writing exercises that she would, and stocking our house with good literature. We lived in a tiny village in West Africa, but our house was full of really good books.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So
do you remember when you sort of said, I could do this? This could be my job.
Well, my mom just told me a few minutes ago that she found a piece of writing from when I was 7 years old, and I was writing about a trip I made to the moon with my stuffed animal. So I've been working on this writing thing for a while. I remember my mom giving me assignments and saying, write about the most boring thing in this room and make it interesting. I also remember having a tape recorder and secretly recording dinner table conversations. I don't know if my family knows this. I have no idea what a tape recorder is. Then I would take it to my room and try to transcribe it and turn it into dialogue. And I realized that real life conversations are nothing like the dialogue you read in books.
But what a training for a journalist, the kind of work you do. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I'm interested in your segue from that childhood to environmentalism. There is actually a statistical correlation between climate denial and evangelical Christianity. But I'm going to hazard a guess that for you, one led to the other in certain respects. Well, you've talked about that sense of understanding injustice as a boy, but were there other elements too of faith?
Well, I mean, certainly when you grow up as a child of missionaries, everything about your life has cosmic significance.
Yeah.
And in some ways, maybe I haven't changed that much from my childhood. I'm not trying to save people's souls, but I'm still trying to save species from extinction.
Yeah.
So, that childhood experience definitely laid the groundwork for who I am. And I mean, I was thinking about this in preparation for this conversation, just about how much we all of us need our lives to have meaning, to have significance. And I just recently reread Five Wives, your novel about the missionaries, and how important it was for them to find meaning in this tragedy of these deaths, and for it to have meaning that carried on in their life. And I think, that's so. That holds true for all of us. We need stories to carry us through this time. We're in a hard time. The earth is in a hard time right now. And there are stories that cause harm, but there are also good stories. And I think that, part of the work that I'm trying to do is contribute to that essential and necessary story of our time.
Well, I think we're more inclined to believe in an apocalyptic scenario too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of people see a climate catastrophe in very abstract terms. They don't feel, it doesn't engage them emotionally. But if you have imagined the end of the world as you know it, all through childhood, I think it's a little easier. Maybe.
Possibly.
Yeah. So I hope most of you read the wonderful feature with Josiah in today's Free Press. Great article, but the headline was Climate Evangelist. And I wondered how you felt about that.
I tweeted the article I've been hibernating from Twitter for a while, but I came back out of hibernation for the promotion of this book, and I said, well, there's probably no word that I would be more uncomfortable with than the word evangelist. However, if I have to be an evangelist for something, you know, collective action for climate justice is probably the thing that I would accept. That I would, you know, maybe, I don't know, maybe I deserve it. I probably do. Maybe there's some, you know, some cosmic irony there in me getting that word.
Well, yeah, I think, you know, most of us that contemplate our role in this are not necessarily so keen even to convince people who are not on board as to mobilize people who are. Because it's a, you know, it's a weight of dread that all of us are carrying to some degree or other. I really found your book, I learned so much. It was almost like a history of the climate movement in Canada. It's, you know, you do so much reading. I think you're probably an autodidact in this field. And, you know, I was writing down the names of writers that I intend to read after having read your book. And I'm kind of guessing that you went down rabbit holes like that in exploring this subject, did you?
Yes, I mean, I certainly, I didn't start out with a, you know, annotated bibliography of books that I felt I needed to read. It was sort of an organic, intuitive process of moving from one thing to the next. I mean, before I traveled to Wet'suwet'en territory, I researched the history of that struggle, and, you know, read about the Supreme Court case in 1991 where the Wet'suwet'en took their land claim all the way to the Supreme Court, and Justice McEachern, who I referenced, you know, that led me to all kinds of interesting books on Wet'suwet'en spirituality and the history of their struggle to, you know, claim their title to their sovereign territory. So, you know, one thing, you know, kind of led me to another. I followed very much, I think, where my curiosity led me. This book is by no means an exhaustive book about the climate crisis and religion and spirituality. You know, 1,000 books would cover that topic. Yeah. So this is a book about my journey and where my curiosity led me, and it's somewhat organic. I didn't want to write something that felt didactic, or I felt like I was telling people, oh, here's the stuff I learned. I wanted it to be a journey that people would accompany on. Right, and that is the story that takes it forward. It's really absorbing because of that. But you weren't, you know, you said at one point that you weren't a risk taker, but I was pretty impressed with some of the adventures that this took you on. And I was, you know, I was really struck by some of the groups in the US, especially like the Wild Church that always worships outdoors, and the kind of extravagant and dramatic way that the people in this movement would express themselves. And I wondered, they were kind of out there. I think I would have been awkward in situations like that. And I'm wondering how it felt for you. When you're doing immersive journalism, you do kind of accept awkwardness as part of the job. I think going into situations, you know, as a writer, as a journalist, writing about this topic, both was, in some ways, it kind of allowed me to set aside my own inhibitions and just say, oh, I need to fully inhabit and experience this thing in order to write about it. And, you know, I read about at the beginning of the book, I talk about the skeptic and the believer. I feel like I have a skeptic and a believer who both live in my heart. There's room for them, both of them in there, but they are constantly fighting. So when I do journalism, I bring them both along, and a lot of these situations I would go to an event, and I have to start with the believer, right? The believer has to come first and has to enter into the ritual or the ceremony or the church service or whatever it is, and fully open to the experience to participate. And then later on, when I'm sitting down at my computer and writing about it, that's where the skeptic comes in and offers some, you know, how tries to think critically about what I just experienced. But so both of those parts of me are
Yeah.
are part of the process.
And were the people in those settings comfortable with the fact that you were there as a pilgrim as they were, but you were also there as a journalist?
Yeah, I was pretty transparent with people about my work. I told them that what I was doing. I told them I wouldn't go into a group, you know, and not, if it was a group of people who were sharing their names or identifying features about themselves with me, I would be clear about my intentions. So sometimes I took notes, sometimes I recorded things. Everybody who's named in this book has my permission to include their names. So a lot of people a lot of people who are in this book have actually read the sections about them before it was published. You know, I'm a journalist who writes for different publications, and a lot of publications, that's not an option, right? There's a policy at magazines. Right. You can't show a piece of writing to one of the subjects before it's published for journalistic reasons. But as an author of a book, I have a little bit more freedom and flexibility, so I can do that, and I do actually believe quite much in the power of that kind of collaborative journalism whenever possible. You know, the exception would be if I'm holding someone powerful to account. I don't wouldn't necessarily get their permission to publish or even necessarily show it to them. But with most of the people in this book, I would. There was some back and forth, and that made the story richer. You know, I would send them a piece of writing, and they would read it and say, "Oh, you know, that's factually accurate, but there's some parts of that story that are missing that make it more." Oh wow! That make it more interesting. Yeah, yeah, well, that's great.
With creative nonfiction, I think there must be a certain temptation sometimes to just enhance things a bit for the shape of the story. I mean, the word fiction does appear in the phrase creative nonfiction. And sometimes if you sense a passage is a little flat, how did you deal with that sort of conflict?
Yeah, I'm definitely trying to do creative nonfiction or narrative nonfiction or literary journalism. There's lots of names for it. You know, about 10 years ago, I did a MFA in creative writing. And before that, I trained as a newspaper journalist. And I thought, I'm going to go and get a degree in creative writing and leave behind the journalism. And I took a really transformational class on literary journalism and learned that you can bring all the techniques of fiction writing to nonfiction writing, you know, plot and character and story arc and tension. The difference is that your structure is similar, but your ingredients are different. So, you know, you're taking facts and assembling a story, but you're still looking for the pieces of the story that fit together. So in my research, I would try to have sort of a shape in mind. This is the shape of this chapter or the story that I'm working on. Where are the pieces that are going to fit the narrative arc? I find that I have to go looking for something, but I also have to be open to the story being different than what I intended it to be or what I expected it to be. If I'm not open to that, then it's going to be a story that's forced into a mold, and that won't be an organic or true story. Yeah. So certainly there's both I guess the creative part in creative nonfiction has to do with that shaping of a narrative. You know, we tell ourselves stories. Yeah. That's how we tell ourselves stories in order to live, as Joan Didion, one of the masters of literary journalism, famously said. Right. Well, with respect to the fictional skills, John read a quote that talked about the way you use language to take us into natural settings. And I have to say that I was really blown away by that. And, you know, to the point that sometimes I felt that resistance I feel about nature because there is so much to fear and dread about the way ecosystems are collapsing. And sometimes it's very hard to read these passages as it's hard to be in nature. But you tell a lot of stories about, you know, going on wilderness trips, and I'm wondering how you're maneuvering through all of that, the feelings that being out in the natural world brings up. Yeah, that's a good question. I do. I did find while I was writing this book, I was paying attention to those feelings when I'm in wild spaces, which, lakes and forests and these wild spaces have given me so much solace and so much comfort and so much of a home in my life that it is hard to see the places that you've cared for so much that are so close to your heart, spiritually, be suffering harm, and wondering about that. So that's something I experience too. I also sometimes, I do often experience that grief in nature that I wouldn't have experienced, in my childhood or a lot. Or I used to think of nature as this unchanging refuge, and now it's still a refuge in lots of ways, but there is also deep sadness there. And that sadness is part of the work that we have to do right now. It's not something, it's okay to feel those feelings.
Well, you quote, if I could just see it on my notes, you quote a writer who talked about caring for nature as we care for a dying parent. It's not because we think we can necessarily save certain aspects of nature, but because we love them. I found that very moving. I don't know if there's sort of a fatalism in that quotation, though.
Yeah, that was Victoria Lewis, who's involved with the Wild Church movement. And I don't find in that, I think in that particular comment that came from an interview that I had with her, it wasn't that she said there's nothing to be done or there's no hope. It was more of a sense of what's our deep motivation for our care for the earth. And in a sense, the deepest motivation isn't from a utilitarian, this is something that I like or that serves me, therefore I'm going to save it. It's more from a deeper sense of love. And then that's when you're drawing on that deeper sense, you do what needs to be done to care for this person, this being, regardless of the outcome. We don't know the outcome of anything, right?
Yeah.
And yet the work before us is the work that has to be done, and we can draw on those deep, spiritual resources to do the work, I think.
Yeah, I look at the subtitle for your book and I find myself thinking that you probably define spirituality differently now than you did 20 years ago.
Yeah, certainly I do. And I will define it differently 20 years from now. So, so it's kind of, a moving target, I guess.
Yeah, you talk, the Free Press quoted you as talking about the mysterious and ineffable force in nature for good. And I wanted to ask you about that. I had two words come to mind: cankerworms. When I don't know if I can entirely grasp what that force is. It's hard for me to think about it necessarily in terms of spirituality, just given how indifferent it often seems that nature is. I think we don't understand, because we have tried so hard to impute almost human emotions to a deity. And it seems as though nature operates from a whole different premise, maybe.
Yeah, no, that's true. It is hard to, separate those strands of what kind of personification, I guess, we're putting on the natural world, just as we try to figure out what kind of personification we're putting on the divine. And yet there is something mysterious and ineffable there. And I think there is something that, there is a sense of for me, there's a sense of being held by that larger divine, force. Whatever creative force caused, brought this whole thing into being over the course of billions of years. There is something to rest in there, I think, for me anyway. I guess maybe the spiritual path is a little bit of part of that spiritual path is, moving away from seeing myself as the center of the universe and just part of a, one beloved part of an integrated whole.
Yeah.
So
And you talk, yeah, I loved what you said about miracle too, that it's not a matter of praying for miracles as much as recognizing the miracle that is life on earth. Yeah, not necessarily imputing it to some abstract force. Yeah, that was wonderful. This was a very timely book. I was really struck by that. But I suspect because things are moving so fast on the planet that there are many threads that you would love to have picked up after this book went to press. So if you could have written another chapter, what do you think it would have been?
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's a good question. There are a lot of things that are changing, and I don't know what that other chapter would have looked like, but I also feel like there are many things that are not changing in the sense of the work that is before us and needs to be done. And we know what work needs to be done. We need to stop burning things. We need to transition very quickly away from burning fossil fuels to other forms of energy, and we need to protect the wild spaces that are left and listen to the indigenous communities that are at the forefront of this struggle, the scientists who are telling us what needs to be done, and the technologies are there in our hands to do it. So in some ways, I feel like the work is still there before us, and the work needs to be done. And that doesn't change necessarily dramatically from day to day, even though things in the world around us are changing.
Yeah, and I think one of the wonderful things about your book is that it addresses the question of despair and the spiritual needs that people who are doing this work have, because I think that's a huge issue. There's a lot of burnout, unfortunate phrase there, among people working in the climate movement. It's quite interesting that this book is being launched just as LaGuardia Airport has shut down flights because of all the particulate matter from forest fires. It's really emphasizes the timeliness of it. Well, I wonder if we can maybe open the floor up for questions from the rest of you. Just now. Yeah.
So we can start off with a question that we just got from John Mark Bergen online, who asks, Josiah, have you considered a foray into fiction, well-crafted stories that profound reach and access to minds and hearts to spread important ideas? And I'm looking forward to your novel, trilogy, or series.
Thanks for that question, John Mark. Yes, fiction is a wonderful form that I have spent some time exploring and hope to do so again. I think every time I turn my mind to fiction, then it helps me, gives me more ideas of how to write nonfiction better. And when I do nonfiction, then it gives me material for writing fiction. So maybe my next book will be a novel, hopefully.
Wonderful. You should alternate.
I think that would be good.
Yeah.
And were there any questions locally? If you have a question, just raise your hand. Yes.
I just wanted to say that I thought it is important to use different styles of writing and more artistic styles of writing, because I think that all of the early stuff written about the climate, certain people can tune into that, but a lot of people can't. So I think what you're doing is expanding the narrative so that many more people will read this and be pulled into it and kind of understand.
Thank you. Yeah, that's certainly my intention, to invite people into the work, and yeah, thank you.
And you look a little young, but are you familiar with Thomas Sankara?
La patrie ou la mort nous vaincrons. Yes, Thomas Sankara was one of my the icons of my childhood. I was only a few years old when he was assassinated. He was the president of Burkina Faso in the 1980s, and a very inspirational figure. I didn't pay close attention to when I was a kid, but as an adult, I've read his speeches and researched his life and written about him a little bit. And he lived with such integrity. He rode a bicycle to work. He believed that the resources of his country could be shared by everyone, and that his country could become independent of outside aid if really they cared for each other. So that's a total digression from my book, but yes, don't get me started talking about Thomas.
Were there any other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much, Josiah and Joan, for such a great event and conversation, and for this book as well. At the beginning of the book, you say that this book isn't for people who are clutching onto their certainties really, really firmly. But I wonder, what would you say, or what would this book say to someone who was a climate change denier?
What would it say to a climate change denier? Well, they probably wouldn't read very far in the book. So, you know, I didn't have stalwart climate change deniers in the front of my mind as my audience. But, you know, I do write about I have a chapter about how that narrative came to be, especially in the US, with among white evangelicals, the demographic that's most likely to disbelieve in climate change. And even that demographic is, I think, changing their minds about it as it becomes increasingly apparent what's happening. But that, you know, it's a search for a narrative, right? That a meaning that gives some shape to your life. And so I don't know that I would be able to persuade a hardcore climate denier of anything, but I feel what I can offer is a different story where people can belong to, because what the climate deniers tell is a very powerful story that people can find a place in and belong to. And so I want to invite people to a different story that they can find a place in and belong to. And you know, the work of working for climate justice is hard work, but there's so much joy and solidarity and friendship and community to be found in that work, that I guess maybe that would be what I would invite them to. I would invite them to
hang around with you for a while.
Yeah, I guess so, if they were willing. Yeah.
I just want to thank you for the book too. And I read in the Free Press article that there's a group of like-minded people here in Winnipeg. And I think for myself, it requires a lot of bravery to speak out. And I would like to, I'm curious about that group. I wonder if you could tell more about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm part of a few different groups here in Winnipeg. One of them is the Manitoba Energy Justice Coalition, a really fantastic group of rad folks who are, some of whom may be in the audience. You see at least one over there, doing wonderful work around climate justice. Maybe the other group that I'm part of is an interfaith group. Is that the group you were thinking of? It's, so there's Christians, Jews, Buddhists involved in this group. And our focus is specifically on this climate plan that the city of Winnipeg has created, commissioned, and voted to approve. It shows how Winnipeg could get to net zero emissions by 2050. It's called the Community Energy Investment Roadmap. And as with so many great reports, it's sitting on a shelf, largely unimplemented. And it's a powerful roadmap of where we need to go, and it exists. And so our work as an this interfaith group, people come to this group out of a deep sense of moral and spiritual conviction. This is the work that we need to do, but when we get together, we're focused on how can we shift the city policy, and we've been meeting with councillors, and they are listening. So it doesn't take a lot of bravery or courage to come to one of our meetings. So you're certainly welcome, as is anyone else who would like to join this growing movement.
And we do have time for 2 more questions. So one in the front and yourself over here.
As I was reading the article in the Free Press this morning and then starting the book today, I was thinking about how you sort of reached out to the faith community and wrote a story that accepts and sort of values that reality. And at the same time, you're reaching out to the secular community to sort of have this scientific approach as well as the mystical and the spiritual. How do you balance those two?
Yeah, I think those two are equally part of the work, the scientific, rigorous scientific understanding of what's happening, and the spiritual, mystical connection with what's happening. Those are equally part of the work, and I don't think any one person needs to fully understand both of those spheres, but I do believe that that the work of climate justice involves both of them. Yeah.
Hi, Joe.
Hey, Greg.
I haven't read the book yet, but I am wondering if you could tell us which parts of the book were the hardest to write. And when you experienced that difficulty, how did you persevere?
Ooh, that's a good question. You know, it's not an exciting answer, but boredom is one of the worst obstacles to writing. You know, you're supposed to write a chapter and the chapter bores you. So I left that one out. Yeah, it was hard. There were lots of things that were hard about it. I mean, the part I read about going to Wet'suwet'en territory, it might not necessarily seem like that hard of a thing to do, but it felt hard for me, putting myself in another space that was completely foreign to me. I felt like I was entering Wet'suwet'en territory very much as a guest to learn. You know, it's always, I would say that was maybe one of the harder things that I did in terms of, and there's the chapter at the end about my pilgrimage in Arizona, where I go and spend 3 days in the desert. That was a pretty hard thing to do. Not in the way I expected it to be at all. I expected it to be hard because I was not eating and you know, alone in the desert. I didn't expect, it turned out to be hard in a different way, in an emotional way. And like, I think maybe one of the hardest parts of writing this book was paying attention to my own emotions around this complex issue and coming to understand that those emotions are important and okay to feel, and you know, learning how to feel those emotions and move forward and not let them, you know, take over my life, but also welcome them and make space for them. Not an easy thing to learn how to do. I'm still learning it.
Thank you so much, Josiah. I now invite you both to offer any closing comments you might have.
Well, thank you so much, Joan, and all of you. I certainly have some thanks to offer. First of all, I want to recognize the many Indigenous nations on whose lands I researched and wrote this book, and who inspire me with their defense of the lands and waters that we all share, and their spiritual relationship with the land. So I wrote this book and researched it on the lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dene, Red River Métis, Wet'suwet'en, Apache, Meskwaki, Yaqui, Thana-Atham. All of those peoples, I spent time on their lands and benefited from their wisdom. So I have deep gratitude to those nations. I certainly want to thank McNally Robinson and John for hosting this wonderful event, making space for all of you. John, you're a charming, wonderful host who I've always appreciated, so thank you. And Joan Thomas for, you know, your wonderful and perceptive questions. I really appreciate that. And for encouraging me along on the way. I want to thank the folks at House of Anansi Press who published this book. You know, you remember that there's something for kids, right? Yeah, it's coming. House of Anansi. I just want, you know, every work of writing is a collaborative work. It's never just one person. There's editors, there's copy editors. My wonderful editor, Siobhan Hearn at House of Anansi. I deeply appreciate her and the work we've done together on this book, and also many other people who worked on this book, copy editors, cover designers, fact checkers, and my agent, well, she's not my agent anymore because she got a different job, but Stephanie Sinclair helped me find a publisher, and Cook McDermott Agency. I'm deeply grateful to them for all their role in producing this book. I have a few thanks for people in the audience here. I see Jonathan over there. He's been my faithful buddy. He's read many drafts of this book over and discussed them over beers. And Sarah, who's also read drafts and offered wonderful feedback. Thank you. Too many people in this audience to name who've supported me along this journey, but especially my parents who are here and who taught me to pay attention to justice in the world and to be a spiritual person in the world. So I'm deeply grateful to them. And to my dear children who allowed me to go on many trips, sometimes reluctantly, and welcomed me back with joy. And of course to Mona, my true love, who's read more drafts of this book than any other person alive except me. Some people have described her as the most interesting character in the book. I certainly think so, but I'll leave that up to you to judge. So anyway, thank you. And thank you all of you for being here. It's really heartwarming to see you. We've got one more fun little thing, and this is for Elias, my 11-year-old son, who said, I've been to many book launches, but I've never seen a book launched before. So we're about to launch a book. Don't worry, it's a small one, it won't hurt anybody. But if you catch it, I'll sign your book for you. Okay, don't let your head be right above it. Are you ready for the book launch? Yeah. Here it comes. Thank you, Elias. I'll sign your book for free.
So while our trebuchet is being taken care of, I just wanted to offer a few quick notes about signing procedure. So we will ask you all to remain in place for just one moment, just to make sure we can get Josiah situated and nicely comfortable at the book signing table. I'll then let you know when it is time to come over and have your book signed. We have copies of the book at the table. We also have copies of the book behind our cash desk. So you can visit the cash desk first or get in line first. You can get a book signed before you pay for it. Just please do pay for the book before you leave the store. Thanks once again to House of Anansi Press for making this evening a possibility, to all of you for your being here, for your attention, for your questions, and just for your presence in general. Thanks to all watching live on YouTube. I did warn you that I was going to get you to applaud Joan Thomas one more time, so to Joan for her wonderful message. And please join me one more time in acknowledging Josiah Neufeld.